I felt both ache and liberation in that moment, knowing the weight of generations still hovered in the air, but also that its shape had changed under my hands, reshaped into something honest and healing rather than buried and shameful. And though I was leaving behind corridors that held suffering and secrets, I carried with me the legacy I had reclaimed. Not the family's old legacy of erasure, but a new one of acknowledgement and endurance, one where firstborn meant survival and voice, not silence and selection. And I stepped into the road with heart full, suitcase lighter than I expected. I drove away slowly, passing the quilt-gathering oak, now concentric circles of stitched names wound into its roots, and realized I was a keeper now, the one charged with continuity, not disinheritance. And ahead lay a life no longer shaped by fear of firstborn fate, but by choice and remembrance. And I thought of the children, Emily, Clara, Elias, Anna Marie, Nathaniel, Jessamine, and the unnamed who had vanished without record, and I whispered their names aloud into the soft morning air, each syllable of vow that they would not vanish again, that each firstborn of my future would begin with ceremony, not suppression, naming, not nullifying. And as I turned onto the highway, miles open before me, the quilt wrapped across the passenger seat looked like a child's embrace, heavy with sorrow and hope, and I knew the task ahead would not be easy, untangling public records, sharing the story, advocating for remembrance rights. But I accepted it, not with pride but with purpose. When I reached the city and checked into a modest apartment above a bookstore, I laid the quilt across the bed and then went to work, typing the first lines of a memoir that would expose the system the Corbyns had built, commissioning journalists to verify the stories, contacting genealogists, and writing to my own future firstborn to tell them that here, in our family, birth would be met with celebration, not curve, memory, not measure. Nights came with lullabies sung into the dark, but these lullabies carried life, not obedience, and I felt my own voice grow strong again, free of a hush that had followed me since infancy. Almost a year later, on a quiet autumn evening, I returned briefly to Corbyn Manor for a memorial service beneath the oak, now ringed by family, friends, even the townspeople who had resisted before and now listened, naming what had gone unspoken. And together we lit lanterns on the quilt, joining firstborns by name, by candlelight, by shared breath, and the manor's windows glowed like open eyes. I watched each lantern placed gently across the grass, one for each named child, one for the unnamed one. And when I placed the final lantern, I realized the weight of legacy was not fate, but voice, and I'd chosen voice. As we all stood in silence, candlelight dancing across the stone walls, I felt the first sigh of peace from the house itself, as though it too exhaled, finally empty of its old secrets. Walking away that night, quilt folded over my arm and hope folded into my heart, I understood the final truth. I am not just a survivor of the Corbyn firstborn fate. I am an undoer. And in that, I was reborn. Firstborn no more, but first among healers. They said being firstborn in the Corbyn family was an honor. But honors don't come with headstones, and mine was carved before I could walk. I parked beside the crumbling stone wall that marked the entrance to Corbyn Manor, the gravel crunching under my tires sounding unnaturally loud in the twilight hush. And when I stepped out with the old brass key I had retrieved from a dusty drawer in my grandmother's study, my heart thudded not with nostalgia, but a nameless dread, because this house held a promise no one dared speak, that every firstborn of the Corbyn line ended the same way, unaccounted or buried before their 5th year. And I, the firstborn of my branch, had come because the pattern was closing again, and whether I was here to witness or end it, I wasn't sure yet. Inside, the foyer smelled of mothballs and aged wood, the walls lined with sepia-toned portraits of children in bonnets, each with eyes too solemn for their small faces, and I felt their gazes land on me as I crossed the threshold. Children from a lineage tangled in lullabies that skipped verses, extinguished giggles, and empty cradles that no longer rocked. I'd been away for 2 decades, but their absence had never left me. Every birthday cake I had blown out, every school recital I had missed growing up in the city, carried a half-remembered ache, a whisper that some voice had not been allowed to sing its own first tune. The heavy front door groaned shut behind me, cutting off the evening breeze, and left me suspended in a silence so thick it pressed against my eardrums until I could almost taste it, and I realized I was already breathing differently, mechanical, expectant, as though I were waiting to hear a cry that would never come. I set my bag by the wide staircase and pushed open the door to my old bedroom, a room lined with faded wallpaper of rabbits dancing under moons, where I swore I heard the faintest echo of a cradle rocking, though I knew that nursery had been empty for decades. Pulling open a dusty trunk, I found a crumpled baptism gown Grandma had made for me, embroidered with pale corsages that mirrored 100 others she'd stitched for infants who never wore them past their first day home, and I ran my fingers along the frayed edge and felt tears welling, not for me but for them, the children never named in the family tree, the ghosts without rest. I rose, caught my reflection in the warped glass of an antique mirror, the same face I'd seen at every family gathering, smiling politely, always careful not to draw attention. Yet in that moment, beneath my poised exterior, I recognized something shift, fear tinted with responsibility. Somewhere deep in the house, I heard a floorboard creak, not behind me but beyond memory's reach, like the house itself was settling into this moment, preparing to reveal what it had long concealed. I closed my eyes and recalled my mother's soft words from years back, trembling when she said, "You've done nothing wrong," but her voice had always carried relief, as though I'd already been counted, already been allowed to stay, and guilt that followed me across continents. Now, back under this roof, I knew I had to face the truth of my own survival, and whether I was here to honor that or to shatter it. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step a rite of passage, leading me deeper into the structure built on hidden tragedies, until I reached the nursery at the top. The door closed, as it always had been, even when I was a child, and standing before it, I laid my hand on the knob and exhaled a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding, thinking, if I turn this key, I'm stepping into the place where legacy became a curse, and I might finally learn whether I'm the survivor or the solution. That I turned the knob with trembling resolve, pushing the nursery door inward on its groaning hinges to reveal the same pale cream walls I remembered, save for the patches where paint peeled in vertical strips as though something had been stripped away, and inside stood the cradle, an ornate antique piece with scrolled oak and tapered spindles, resting in the corner beneath the shuttered window, silent and still, its mattress sunken into the same indentation where it had first ushered life into Corbyn history, before every firstborn after had vanished one by one, and even though the crib had collected decades of dust, even though no gentle rocking had filled the room since my own infancy, I could almost feel its momentum, as if the ghosts of those who'd lain in it still clung to its grooves, pressing faintly against the wood like echoes of breath. My pulse accelerated as I crossed the faded floral rug, knees weak with memory, noticing the faint stains at the edges, dried tears or spilled milk. I could no longer tell, while the pastel mobiles overhead, once spinning with cheerful angels, had long since collapsed, tangled in threads like half-forgotten hymns, and I swallowed tightly, my throat dry, because this room was less about the absence of a child than the absence of explanation, and the silence here was heavy with unspoken secrets. I knelt beside the cradle and laid my palm on its rim, feeling the smoothness worn by fingers I would never know, and it would press against me like an unvoiced welcome, creepy and tender all at once, and the air smelled of old linen infused with something colder, loss, perhaps, or the lingering ache of dreams unfulfilled. I leaned forward, peering inside the cradle, half expecting to see some specter, some imprint of memory, but the mattress was blank, unmarked, and in the emptiness I felt a rush of grief that surprised me, grief not for who'd passed, but for the one who never had a chance to begin. I ran my fingers along the spindles and noticed etchings, small scratchings made by a child, maybe a sibling too young to understand what death meant. Letters spelling M-R-I-A, L-I-S, A-N-N-A, names that belonged to infants I had never met, but whose stories had been cut short before ever spoken. I closed my eyes, imagining them breathing here, their hearts beating only briefly, their mothers cradling them beneath lullabies abandoned at the edge of dawn, and I realized each firstborn before me had left a ghost in this very corner of the world, and their absence shaped every decision made in the house. Who'd be allowed birthday candles, who'd be given the baby bonnet, who'd be introduced as the heir, and who'd be quietly removed, without funeral, without explanation. A single tear slipped down my cheek as I recalled how my own christening had been a hushed affair. One candle, one prayer, not too many words, for fear of jinxing what could not be taken back. And I'd never questioned it, never understood it until that breathless moment, kneeling beside this timeless cradle, that I'd been born into that fear. The room felt smaller then, closing in, the wallpaper's floral patterns swirling into shadows that crept along the floor, and I drew in a sharp gasp as I realized I was not properly dressed to leave. Not yet. I hadn't paid respects, hadn't acknowledged them. My hand shook as I reached for the trunk at the foot of the bed. One part Old Hope, one part repository of infant clothes. Lifting its lid to reveal pieces of tiny garments, a lace-trimmed pacifier holder, woolen booties knit in cream, and fragile onesies embroidered with initials that matched the names carved into the cradle. I picked up a bonnet, its silk ribbon frayed, the lining stiff in the shape of a skull cap, and when I held it to my face, I smelled baby powder and sorrow, and remembered the ache I felt when my own baby shower was canceled with a vague mention of old memories, and no one would say more. I pressed the bonnet against the cradle, as though laying to rest, and felt a whisper in my mind that chided me not to waste another generation's loss, not to leave them unacknowledged. I brushed aside tears and rose to my feet, scanning the room for any sign I had the right to take this next step. A locket on the bedside table, tarnished silver, holding a faded photograph of a woman with sorrowful eyes and a small infant cradled in her arms, a mother who'd lost everything else that same year. My reflection in the nursery window stared back at me, grown resolute, but haunted by a lineage of quiet tragedy, and for the first time, I understood what I must do. Whether I was the next firstborn or the last, I would name them, all of them, even those before memory had names, and I would let their absence speak out loud. So this cradle could finally become a monument instead of a tomb, and the shadows here might finally allow daylight back inside. I found myself lingering in the drawing room, where brass birthday plaques lined a polished mahogany cabinet, rows of tiny silver tags, each etched with a date, a name, and then nothing more, and my breath caught. When I noticed the gaps, every firstborn child had a plaque issued, a party planned, a cake, but beyond the first candle, there were no second birthdays, no third, no fourth, and as I traced the dates with a trembling finger, Anna Corbyn, April 3rd, 1865, Elias Corbyn, August 17th, 1872, Maria Lane Corbyn, March 12th, 1901, Nathaniel Corbyn, September 29th, 1920, Clara Corbyn, February 8th, 1958, my mother's firstborn, unnamed, stillborn in 1983, and then me, the next firstborn, still ordained to live. I felt the veneer of pride that had always clouded the Corbyn lineage begin to crack in my chest, because these were not celebrations but test markers, checkpoint ribbons in a family experiment designed to permit the survival of exactly one child and no more, and the room, adorned with faded wallpaper cherubs offering cakes, and a dusty banner still draped over the mantel that read, "Congratulations, first to one," in gilt script, swelled with a hollow grandeur that made my heart ache as though it had been overshadowed by each extinguished candle before me. I sank onto the velvet chaise and closed my eyes, trying to filter the emotion rationally. These were diseases, accidents, illnesses, and error with poor medicine. But the weight of ritual gnawed at any reason. The same porcelain plates, inherited recipes, posed portrait with birthdays, sashes, and candles lit in perfect tradition, every child who come too early in the family scroll, and no one ever spoke after the next spring. Their chairs returned to the mahogany table as if they'd never mattered. I thought of my own childhood birthdays, how I'd always felt obligated to stand humbly while extended family sang happy birthday with forced cheer, the cake briefly interrupting conversation before the quiet resumed, how invitations came with caveats. No big parties, just a family, even though the house could have held 50 people, until adolescence, when I discovered eventually that my mother's face would flicker uneasy when we brought friends over, not because of cost, but because those friends might ask about siblings or babies or, worse, how many children had been, and the family would freeze, conversation crumbling in a moment. My chest constricted then, as I opened my eyes and looked around the silent room, noticing simultaneous comfort and suffocation. Stuffed animals perched on shelves reserved for birthday trophies, empty frames for a most well-behaved child, and in the corner, rolled-up crepe paper banners embroidered with the date of the next month's birthday milestone, sequestered with crusted ribbons stashed away until needed. I understood then that the entire Corbyn family had been ticking off birthdays, as if measuring life by endurance, not by time, and those who couldn't meet the next threshold were politely unassigned, unseen, never spoken, the plaques erased or buried under furniture until no one remembered their names. My hand shook as I reached up to touch the banner. It was brittle, and it cracked as if pleading in protest, and I pulled it free, stepping back, noticing that each plaque was padded by velvet pouch. That is, until I came to my own name, which had no pouch at all, just a polished brass shine that glinted on the chandelier, unworn and too conspicuous, and I felt a rush of shame, reserved attention, focused carefully, stretched across family events, until I weathered all the rituals they needed me to, but it also marked me as different, and I realized that I've lived so far was to survive a systemic ritual of grooming, a path laid out by my elders in silent calculation. I traced my fingers slowly over the brass date and name, and felt the empty chairs that passed birthdays, the hush after candles blew out, the way celebration ended too soon, and the idea that firstborn celebrations were never meant for children, but for the restless need to try again, until the right child lasted long enough to remember. I sat there quietly, heart guttering, until the door creaked and I turned to see my aunt, the one who'd planned those parties and sewn my sashes, crossing the threshold with a cake board and wrapped in crepe paper shadows of earlier years, awkward, polite, eyes downcast because she'd never wanted to do this. Could have lost her own pregnancy in the corridor before. She'd once told me. And now, carrying the cake for my 25th birthday, placed it in the center of the table, lit one candle, then paused, tears pooling at her lids though she tried to smile. She leaned in, nose brushing cornsilk hair, and whispered, "Happy birthday, dear." And my breath felt stolen by compassion I wasn't sure I deserved, and I realized then that every family party had been a collective performance of hope and fear, an attempt to ward off silence, to reset the ritual for another year of conditions, and I accepted that cake with trembling fingers, cutting through the delicate frosting, tasting sweetness laced with sorrow and relief, and I whispered into its glow, "Thank you for trying one more time," because I couldn't say any of the names that had come before, not yet. But tonight, I found the journal in a carved walnut cabinet tucked beside the nursery's closet, a cabinet I'd once believed held only baby blankets. And pulling it free sent a cloud of stale air into the room, as though decades of silence had gathered behind its doors in patient anticipation. And as I sat cross-legged on the nursery rug with a yellowed tome in my lap, I felt the house tighten around me, like a trap slowly closing, because every page I turned revealed more than birth records. It listed whispered diagnoses, odd commentaries in the margins, coded references to fragile disposition, maternal anxiety, and worst of all, entries such as see footnote 12. If firstborn shows resistance, consider relocation options. And the footnote itself described locations with phrases like Bell House Annex and Quiet Room instead of cemeteries, using euphemisms that twisted benevolence into something grotesque. And I realized I was reading not helpful medical history, but the blueprint of a system, one that identified weakness in newborns and responded not with medicine or comfort, but with control, containment, and erasure. My breath came shallow as I traced a midwife's careful cursive, noting her gradual descent from concerned advocate, dashing off comments like, "Baby appears unwell, recommend regular visits and maternal rest," to detached instrument of family policy, marking entries like Case number 15, infant quiet beyond acceptable norm, and Case number 17, mother recommends early transition per family directive, and each cross line screamed complicity. I spotted payments recorded to the Draper estate in discrete columns, the same estate funding public works in the town, reported as a civic project, but matching dates of firstborn disappearances, proof of hush money, spun as charity. My hands trembled as I turned to her final pages, where handwriting wobbled, ink smudged as if tears had blurred the script, and a note read, "Filed report to Dr. Hayes, maternal guilt unsustainable. Next case to be handled directly by estate." I could no longer watch. Below that hastily scrawled were words that almost obliterated the writer, but I could make out, "They deserve to be remembered." I pressed my palm to the nursery floor, overwhelmed by the quiet weight of remembrance. This midwife had tried to protect the children, then failed, and her final act was to hide this here, in this very room I'd feared to revisit, hoping someone might someday read it and remember before silence closed again. Tears pricked my eyes as I noticed the date, June 3rd, 1958, just 2 days after my great-uncle had gone missing. The date always marked in family histories as a simple departure, and here it was recorded in brutal clarity. Expected complications. Infant expired. Disposition per family. And that word, expired, chilled me, because it was clinical antiseptic, erasing personhood, turning disappearance into medical aftermath, as though loss were just another data point. I closed the journal for a moment, staring around the nursery with fresh eyes. The cradle, the plaques, the toys, all lined up like support beams in a structure built on suffering. My mouth tasted like blood, like guilt. I reopened the journal to find a small envelope taped between the pages. Inside was a faded photograph of a sleeping infant in the cradle, a name scrawled beneath in a child's trembling hand. Emily. No surname, no date, just Emily. I held the picture in my chest and wept for the ones who never had their story told. Emily, Anna, Elias, Clara, Nathaniel, and for myself, the living firstborn who had inherited the burden of memories not hers alone, and who now held proof of a terror disguised as tradition. I rose with journal, photograph, and resolve, the room's hush following me down the hall. I crossed the threshold between curiosity and duty, and now every step I took was for them. For Emily's lullaby that never echoed, for Clara's vanished first laugh, for all the lullabies that ended in hush. And I knew with aching certainty that I would not let this lie rest another year. IT began with a loose floorboard in the corner of the nursery, something I didn't remember ever being out of place. And as I knelt and pressed against it, the wood gave just enough to break my breath in half, like air rushing into a lung that had forgotten how to expand. And when I pried the panel aside, I discovered the basement door, small and square, its edges sealed with wax and dust, untouched for decades but pulsing with the heaviness of withheld horrors. My heart hammered in my throat as I flicked on my phone's flashlight and traced the door seams, the smell of damp earth and kerosene lamp smoke rising. With it, and I hesitated only a moment before bending to lift the latch, a heavy iron handle cold and unwilling in my palm, and swung the hatch upward, unleashing a rush of stale air and an old darkness that seemed to inhale, not exhale, and I felt the walls closing on me as if warning me away. But I had already committed. The first step down the ladder scratched across my skin as I descended, each rung echoing like footsteps in a tunnel of dread, and at the bottom the soft beam revealed a space, not built for storage but for burial, clustered with wooden miniature coffins, half a dozen at least, painted in pastels and lined in satin. My hand shook as I ran my light across them, each one whispering a name I'd never spoken, and I crouched to lift one. It was smaller than my palm, simple in design, yet cruel in symbolism, and I saw a single tuft of brown hair looped inside, preserved in time, as though whoever placed it meant to remember exactly what no one had allowed to live. And as I moved around the chamber, I found tiny garments, onesies, bonnets, booties, painfully tiny, each folded and laid out on stone slabs, stained by moisture and lined with yellow padding, and I realized these were not some symbolic graves, not artistic statements, but the remains of actual infants removed from the world, but hidden, sealed, cherished in secret, witnesses to a mother's grief and a family's shame. And I felt bile in my throat at the thought that they'd been buried alive, or suffocated to silence their breath, so the house would not hear their lullabies. My flashlight caught motion in the corner. Boxes of birth certificates, records of baptisms, death certificates labeled unknown cause, their ink faded but still legible and cruel in bureaucratic finality, and I dropped to my knees feverish, rifling through them, matching names with those etched in the nursery, those on the plaques, those in the midwife's journal, and the pattern was undeniable. Every firstborn child who showed emotional variance, nonconformity, restlessness, as discreetly noted in bureaucratic code, ended up here, beneath the nursery floor, in a private vault of sorrow and suppression, and the enormity of it crashed over me in waves. Decades of decisions cloaked in love, fear twisted into ritual, duty masquerading as necessity, and most horrifyingly, care disguised as cruelty. Somewhere in the back of that cramped space, I found a brittle note, sealed inside an envelope addressed to whomever next, in handwriting I recognized, my grandmother's, her familiar cursive trembling between formal loops, and inside she'd written, "Only the strongest may live." For them, the house, the name. The air tightened around me, blood pounding in my ears, my chest heaving, as I realized she minced no words of moral clarity, had rationalized murder as guardianship, and I felt my stomach twist in physical protest, the weight of survival suddenly a noose around my own throat, because I was living proof of their beliefs. I had survived because I was deemed strong, obedient, pliable, and the others who weren't, who threatened the house's perimeter control, were broken gently, sealed away, erased from rooms, from books, from memory. But not from here, not from this hidden chamber of collective guilt. My hand shaking, I lifted another tiny coffin lid, saw the dried rose petals inside, the lock of hair, the folded note. "Sing for us," and the edges of the note had faint stains, tears or christening water. I couldn't tell, but I pressed my fingers to it and felt my own tears break free, the quiet dam I kept intact finally shattering as I sobbed in the chamber. The hidden basement under the nursery floor that held their lives in secret, their souls in silence. I pressed my hand against the smooth coffin and vowed to break this silence, to speak their names, to make this room seen. The house creaked above, as though protesting or mourning, and I climbed out, engulfing grief but resolute, closing the hatch carefully, but leaving it unlocked. The nursery light flickered once as I stepped across the threshold, and I knew the Corbyn legacy had shifted, not with defiance, but with quiet crisis, and I walked into the hallway, dusty crates of baby clothes and ledgers now bathed in harsh responsibility. Every breath a promise to the hidden graves beneath the floor, every step forward a rebellion against a cycle that had claimed so many firstborns. And as the door to the nursery swung closed behind me, I understood what darkness truly belonged to the Corbyn family. Not the night, but the shame of children whose names were canceled before falling asleep, and the quiet human soul's demand to finally be heard. I returned to the nursery's pale walls with swollen heart and swollen fingertips that carried tremors of sorrow as I traced the delicate, decades-old scratches behind the crib. Each line a syllable in an unspoken litany that had been etched into oak to remember what the family intended never to acknowledge. And there, carved with varying degrees of care and desperation, were names: Emily, jagged but deliberate; Clara, rounded and trembling; Elias, etched deep as if to bite into it for permanence; Anna Marie, graceful but cracked halfway; Nathaniel, small, neat, almost clerical; and the most recent, the one I recognized faintly in my own memory, Jessamine, letters spaced as if a child had taught herself to write, each stroke a plea for ownership over life, not control, and tears blurred my vision as I crouched again, tracing the letters with my thumb, feeling the grooves press into my skin like braille from the dark. And I realized that these were not relics of artful ancestry, but raw lines scored into the structure by hands that needed to mark their existence before it was forcibly erased by the family's unspoken decree. The wood under my palm was warm, not from the sun, not from heat lamps, but from human grief, human insistence, the stored anguish of mothers who folded love into form, even as they had to watch it break. And I closed my eyes to hear them, our firstborns, their voices whispering back. I was here. I existed, and the room pulsed with their stories, silent yet insistent. I stood, stepping back, noticing other carvings, flowers beneath names, hearts, tally marks counting birthdays they never celebrated, dates added next to names that didn't line up with registry books, as if someone followed a script only they could read. Jessamine, May 12th, 85, Nathaniel, September 29, 20, and none matched the plaques downstairs that marked out each firstborn as a successful heir. Some had no acknowledgement at all in official documents, yet here they were under the nursery's gentle watch, carved into beams, hidden in shadows, demanding memory. My breath tremored as I ran my light along the cracks between floor and wall, finding names again. Elias, scratched twice over in different handwriting, one neat, one frantic. Clara, surrounded by a crude circle, as though circled to preserve her. And by the window, Emily carved large, her name spilling toward the sill as though she reached for freedom she never received. And I realized this nursery was not just a child's room. It was a living archive of firstborns, a skeleton key to the family's greatest shame, and the weight of this quiet library pulled at me with physical force, pressing grief into my lungs, stealing breaths in measured intervals. I answered them, softly, whispering each name like a ritual to anchor them to air and light, confirming their right to be heard. Emily, Clara, Elias, Anna Marie, Nathaniel, Jessamine, and after the final name hung between us, I pressed my palm flat to the wall, fingertips over the shallow gouges, and felt the tremors beneath the wood. Not supernatural, but subtle contractions, the house settling under the burden of its own secrets, as if our shared grief had weight and would finally leave a mark of real presence, not erasure. My eyes fell on one final name, written lower, halfway erased by years of whitewash. Unnamed, and I sank to my knees, because this one spoke of too many siblings I never knew, children whose lives were never granted even a name, even a memory in etchings, just a blank line smudged out by those who fear accountability, and I wept for her worst fate, that of being entirely forgotten, her soul lost between silence and suppression. And in that moment, I understood why I'd come. The cradle in the corner, the plaques downstairs, the midwife's journal in the hidden basement, they all pointed here, to this heart of remembrance, this shrine of confession carved into the bones of the room, and I vowed to give them what had been withheld, life through memory, dignity through acknowledgement, permanence through voice. I rose unsteadily and braced my hand on the cradle again, the wood beneath warm with the promise of names yet to come, names I would speak aloud, refusing the family cycle of erasure. And with that promise echoing in my heart, I walked toward the door, past the names that had anchored me in grief, and I knew the next step would be the hardest yet, to share their stories with the world, to open the pages of shame and let shame have daylight, and to let this nursery be no longer a cage, but doorway on which each name could finally walk into the world and be seen. I found the door hidden behind a tall, silk-screened divider in the hallway adjacent to the nursery, a nondescript panel painted the same pale cream as the walls, no knob visible, only a faint keyhole tucked beneath a carved panel of dancing cherubs, an insult to the silence it concealed, and I stood before it, feeling my pulse drum in my ears, as though the door itself had become a barrier not just between rooms, but between reality and absolution, and when I slid the key I'd taken from, Grandmother's old satin clutch into the lock, it turned with reluctant smoothness, as if awakening from a long slumber, and I pulled the door open to reveal a corridor wider than anything I'd seen in that wing, lined on both sides with floor-to-ceiling glass partitions, each one a viewing window into small, padded rooms no larger than nursery closets, each equipped with a mounted gramophone and a speaker set overhead, and a simple wooden cradle in the middle, empty now, but each room was tagged, with a name, Emily Clara Elias. And as I peered inside the first chamber, I noticed the grade record spinning slowly, the speaker periodically clicking as if frozen mid-play, and I realized with a sixth sense of understanding that lights dimmed and tones played at set intervals, each room wired to deliver lullabies or white noise on a strict schedule dictated by steel timers and family protocol. It was an auditory laboratory built not for caring, but for conditioning, an experiment in quieting, in sculpting infants into exactly the kind of firstborn this family demanded, by submerging them in endless loops of gentle sound, never unpredictability, never wakeful curiosity, only measured comfort until voices yielded to silence. I stepped inside, floorboards whispering beneath my feet, and pressed my ear to glass. Inside, the cradle shone faintly in the low lamplight cast from overhead, but no one lay inside. It was a relic, but evidence of methodical intention. On the floor, I saw a single record sleeve, Lullabies for Compliance, Corbyn edition. My blood chilled. Each track name was clinical. Rest at 1 week, Quiet at 3 months, Compliance at 11 weeks, and the markers next to some tracks read Extended or Halted, shorthand for sudden changes in protocol, a child who needed more or received less depending on performance. I followed the corridor to the far end, where a thick glass wall separated me from a control room lined with creaky wooden cabinets and ticking timers. Stacks of spoken-word logs lay in boxes. Clara, fuss at tone change, Elias. Woke before 4 a.m. again. Nathaniel. Cry lasted over 30 seconds, each entry scored with check boxes. Continue. Escalate. Reassigned to quiet room. And there was handwriting overlapping the logs, my grandmother's neat script, annotating when each record should be adjusted or withdrawn, when a child should be moved to deeper silence, using euphemisms like tranquilized or reprocessed. I ran a shaking hand along the wall, glass cool beneath my palm, and realized this was the heart of the project. To force silence in the minds of infants before they ever learn to speak freely, to teach them that quiet was survival, to warp instinct into compliance. Memories flooded me. My own infancy, The hush of the manor when I cried at night. The way someone always appeared beside me, pale in the air with inscrutable calm. Warm milk offered in silver spoons. Patted away from sleep, never comforted during full cries, and now, faced with evidence of the methods behind my upbringing, I felt the fragile fulfillment of childhood unravel in my hands. I found a playback log pinned to the control panel beside the glass, showing dates that matched each birth and disappearance. Each lullaby episode ending when children fell silent or were deemed less viable. Entries capped off with R.I.P. Quiet Achieved, chilling both in intent and tone. My chest seized. The mechanisms of loving care have been replaced with systematic psychological engineering. Every firstborn groomed to obey, groomed to silence themselves, and if they failed, move into deeper rooms, emptied of warmth until they stopped existing to the family, or in some cases, stopped breathing altogether. I turned, seeing the glass walls smear with perspiration as my world tilted, and realized that this room, this lullaby room, functioned not to soothe, but to destroy through repetition and silence. I staggered, pressed my palm over my mouth, tried to hold back a raw scream that threatened to render me voiceless. I thought of Emily, Clara, Elias, of Jessamine's carved name in the nursery, of the coffins beneath the floor, of the midwife's grief. Their lives engineered, measured, and eradicated in service of a legacy too frightened of life's noise. I stumbled out of that corridor, leaving the glass tanks of loneliness and control behind me, each one a silent tomb, each record a monument to lost potential. The door clicked shut behind me as I keyed the jade charm hanging on the corridor hook, an object I found among grandmother's personal effects, a symbol she kept in that room for reasons I once believed moral, but now I recognize a control token, a psychological bedrock to ground each lullaby episode in calm deception. Now it lay silent. I walked toward the staircase, feeling as though I carried not just notes, but weight from every suppressed scream I never heard. And I knew the lullabies were meant to lull the infants into stillness. They had not lulled me entirely. And so I would speak. Not lullaby, not hush, but truth that I found her in a sunlit room of the town's nursing home, seated in a faded armchair beside a window that overlooked a garden of forget-me-nots, an appropriate tribute to the midwife's work. And although she no longer recognized me at first, I recognized her instantly from the sepia photographs hidden between the midwife journals and the baptism certificates. Thin wrists, soft gray curls tied with yellow ribbon, and eyes that had once watched. The birth and silencing of too many firstborns, and when I said, "I'm from the Corbyn family," her gaze, glassy with age, flickered to life with something like horror, something like prayer, and she reached for my hand with fingers trembling not from illness, but from memory long buried beneath decades of silence. Her name was Mrs. Edwina Hartsley, and when I introduced myself, she said only, "You shouldn't have made it," not cruelly, but like someone witnessing a living ghost, and then she cried. Not loudly, not with hysteria, but with the quiet shame of someone who once believed obedience was mercy, and I sat with her, gripping her hand while her breath caught in time with 1,000 yesterdays, and eventually she whispered. There were rules, and then there were choices. I stopped choosing near the end. I asked her about the rooms, the lullaby chambers, the birthing logs, and she nodded, slowly, as if confirming memory she had tried for years to suffocate. They wanted calm babies, she said, quiet, perfect children who wouldn't challenge the line. When the firstborns came out loud or wrong, they were reviewed. That word, reviewed, it hit me harder than if she'd said discarded or terminated. Reviewed sounded clinical, procedural, something carved into policy and wrapped in velvet. And you? I asked. You helped. She winced, looking away, then nodded. I believed them when they said it was better for children, that those who were removed were never meant to suffer, that the family knew best. She paused and added, but I saw too much. I saw the same face cry over too many beds, same lullabies, same final visits, same prayers. She took a breath. I wrote it all down, hid the pages in the lining of the wall, in the crib's legs, in the staircase. My heart stopped. You what? I asked. The journals, they're yours? Her eyes met mine, watering again. I knew one day someone would come looking. Not a Corbyn heir, not one of the quiet ones, but someone who made it out and came back louder. I hoped you'd hear them. The babies. They don't stop crying just because we stop listening. I felt the tears rise again, pressing like tides behind my eyes, and asked, "Why didn't you go to police?" And her face twisted with the memory of futility, of doors closed by privilege and wealth. The Corbyn name ran too deep. Their donations built hospitals, schools. And the police, the doctors, they took money. I reported one. He disappeared. She paused. Like them. I leaned in closer, voice trembling. And the mothers? Did they know? Her answer broke something inside me. Some knew, some agreed. The legacy mattered more than love. But most were told it was fate. Weak hearts, quiet lungs, natural causes. She gripped my hand tighter. But your mother screamed. I heard her through the walls. She said she wouldn't let them take you. She clung to you through sedation. I thought they'd take her too. I froze. I had never been told that. I had no memory of being held back from death. They let her keep you, Edwina whispered, but only if she promised to leave, to raise you away. They made her swear you'd never come back, never ask. I couldn't breathe. But she died. I said, cancer. I found her journals. She said almost nothing about all this. Edwina's face softened. That was the price. Her silence. It bought your life. I sat back, hollow, devastated, and quietly grateful in a way that felt like blasphemy. Edwina reached to a drawer beside her chair, shakily pulling out a key wrapped in tissue. There's one more room. I wasn't allowed inside, but I knew where it was. It's where they made decisions. The fathers, the uncles, the council. I took it in trembling fingers. The tissue was stained, the key old. Open it, she said, and don't close again. We sat in silence then, the sun warming the room, birdsong filtering in over the scent of flowers blooming just outside, and I realized the world had gone on despite the deaths, despite the legacy, and it could still go on again, differently, better. As I rose to leave, she gripped my arm. Speak their names, she said. Make them real again. I nodded, and in that quiet, blooming room, the forgotten midwife gave me back their voices. I carried the key Mrs. Hartsley had given me back to Corbyn Manor, feeling its cold metal press into my palm like a promise, and soon found a locked cabinet in the vestibule of the drawing room, tall, lacquered, and decorated in distressed panels showing children's silhouettes fading toward darkness. Inside, photographs lay stacked unorganized but solemnly poised, funeral portraits black and white, each, featuring a frail firstborn laid in open caskets with stern-faced clergy and family members posed as lifeless as the deceased, their dresses and suits frozen in stiff reverence. I lifted the top photo. Clara Corbyn, 1958, camera gazing straight down her form, hands folded, lips pressed firmly, and behind her in the frame, barely visible, almost subliminal, was the corner of a painted cradle pattern on the floor, meaning the casket was in a nursery, not a chapel. I flipped through the stack, heart accelerating with each image. Nathaniel in 1920, framed by the same floral wallpaper, a hand, too small to be adult, resting on the casket, the nails desaturated and grimy, holding on. Emily, 1865, propped against that same carriage-style cradle, her infant body undisturbed in a living room so familiar it could have been my childhood home. And in each photo lurked the nursery's silent witness. The same worn floorboards, the same scroll cradle designs, the same curtains drawn heavy even in daytime, as though privacy was required even in death. I studied every image, searching for anomalies, until I discovered them, items that didn't belong. On Clara's photo, a small shovel leaning in the corner. On Nathaniel's, a box wrapped in dark cloth. On Emily's, the midwife's journal half visible on a nearby chair. And on Jessamine's funeral portrait, the last we had, an envelope tucked behind her folded hands. The same slender envelope bore Emily's name in faded cursive. And I realized in that instant that each funeral had been staged in the nursery. Each death had been camouflaged as a domestic ending. Each ending designed not to mourn, but to sanitize. My pulse thundered as I felt those small shapes pressed through time, hidden in the frames. Symbols of concealed intent, not grief. I traced the envelope's visible edges in Jessamine's photo, remembering the one I held, and I choked on realization. Those funerals had never been public events. They were renditions for the camera to tell the rest of the world, to declare the child gone from my life, but not from their lineage. Each photograph was a contract of forgetting to society and remembering within the walls. I returned each portrait slowly, sensation crawling along my nerves, each step back in the cabinet more like bowing before litany, until I reached the last photo, a blurred image of a child too motionless to breathe, but so new, so unformed, the shutter caught her mid-pause, and no name was printed, just a date. 2002, my year. My breath caught at how recent it was, how sanctioned, how sinister. I pulled it out, unfolded the crease back, and found in perfect cursive, Firstborn, completed, the final lesson in their lineage of decisions. Anguish and rage started to burn deep, but then I remembered Mrs. Hartley's final words. Speak their names. I whispered, Clara Corbyn, Nathaniel Corbyn, Emily Corbyn, Jessamine Corbyn. Each name lingered in the hush of the drawing room as though said aloud by their small voices, and I felt their weight shift in the house. No longer lost to sepia pages, but carried in the air. Tears blurred my vision, but clarity sharpened. The Corbyn legacy didn't just kill firstborn children, it erased their journeys with divine dignity. And behind that thin veneer of funeral optics lay the nursery's cruel heart. Loss as aesthetic, death as ritual, breeding silence in stone and photograph. I laid the photos on the near-burnished table, arranged them in order not of death but of ascension, and resolved to let them stand here, willed into presence, not buried further. I left the cabinet half open, as though on purpose, so anyone wandering might see the images unassumingly displayed, clues to a pattern that no longer fit under the rug of family lore. And as I stepped back into the corridor, the photos whispering memory onto the walls, I exhaled with the weight of their revelations. I was no longer the only firstborn. Their echo was beside me, and I would carry their names forward into daylight, into record, into reckoning. I found her in the East Wing sunroom, the place she'd always insisted was her refuge, its tall windows filtering late afternoon light into a quiet haze over a frail frame seated beside a low table, delicate lace doily, teacup teetering, weary matriarch who had once commanded the Corbyn name with quiet authority, and as I stepped in, she looked up with eyes that no longer flared with pride or defiance, but glistened with exhaustion, as though she bore the weight of many silent truths. I sank into the chair opposite hers, laying funeral photographs and midwife's journal between us like evidence of a long-buried trial, and she exhaled slowly, her hand lifting to grip her shawl, as if bracing for confession, and I asked, voice steady, heart racing, "Why did you let this happen? Why did you let every firstborn die or disappear?" She stared at me, and when she spoke, her voice was soft, broken. "Because I believe in legacy." The words tasted like ash. Legacy? I echoed. At the cost of children? Her shoulders trembled. We were protecting the line, the estate, the family name. I leaned in, anger simmering, but not protecting them. She closed her eyes. They would have been lost to chance, to tragedy beyond our walls. We gave them order. We gave them quiet. I swallowed bile. You chose silence before life. The crease in her brow deepened. It was necessary. The world changed. Medicine failed. Stillbirths rose. We faced the impossible. I shook my head, disbelief and grief flooding me. No, you faced fear. Fear made you call names expired. You turned lullabies into weapons. You made firstborns into placeholders. Every birthday plaque, every funeral photo, every lullaby chamber, all proof the Corbyns manufactured children into legacy, not love. She stared at the tea table, quivering. "You know about the basement?" she whispered. I nodded, voice trembling. Tiny coffins, names carved in the walls. Her lip quivered. Those decisions weren't easy. My chest burned. They were crimes. She crumpled, leaning forward. "I'm old now. I lived through it. I watched grandchildren die to preserve a myth I helped build." Tears filled her eyes. "I regret more than I can ever atone for." My breath caught. "Then help me end it." She looked at me, Resolve settling over pain. Tell their names. Tell their stories. You're the last firstborn. You survived by design. Use that gift. My voice trembled, but I nodded. I will. We sat in silence as sun fell through stained glass onto old grief. She reached out, placing her trembling hand over mine. They deserve that much. And so do you. I closed my eyes. In that fragile gesture, I felt the legacy begin to unravel. Not with defiance, but with acknowledgement. And when I stood to leave, she whispered, "Speak for all of us." The sunroom watched me go, and as the door closed, I carried with me not shame, but purpose. To break the cycle of quiet, to give life back to the silence it's stolen, I returned to the nursery at dawn, the light filtering through dusty curtains as if it had paused on its way in, waiting for me to do something with it. And the old cradle, the silent sentinel of centuries, loomed in the center of the room like a challenge rather than a relic, and I felt its ancient gravity pulling me forward to dismantle everything it had held in place. I laid out all the evidence on the rug. Funeral photos, the midwife's journal, the playback logs, the tiny coffins, and even the key Mrs. Hartley had entrusted to me, then paused at the doorway as footsteps approached, and in walked my aunt and uncle, siblings bound by the same guilt as a matriarch, their faces drained of surprise but full of sorrow, as though they'd been bracing for this awakening, but still afraid to face it. And I held up the key. They were preparing again, I said quietly. A new firstborn is due, and everything was lined up. Plaques, lullaby recordings, sealing letters, payment forms. Their gazes flickered to each other, braced. I continued. The cradle was polished. Another tiny quilt was embroidered. Cabinets unlocked. They expected to continue. My aunt's lips trembled. "We had no choice," she whispered. "It's how the legacy lives." I knelt before the cradle and pressed my palm to its worn edge. "It doesn't have to. Not again, not now." I looked at their faces, seeing decades of buried regret. "We start here," I said, lifting the quilt. "This cannot be used." I placed it outside the nursery window and locked the door, turning the key in a small, symbolic ceremony. The nursery stood empty again, truly empty, but not silent, and I backed out, leaving the door closed but unlocked, a threshold left open for change. They stood with me, the three of us, and I guided them downstairs to the family archives where the ledgers were kept, and we delivered them to the town clerk, complete with sworn affidavits and photo documentation. As we handed over each ledger, each journal, each recording log, I felt the unseen weight lift, an ancestral burden being lifted page by page. And when the clerk looked at us with wide-eyed disbelief and compassion and began entering the records into public file, I knew this was more than confession. It was a demolition of the system built on silence. My uncle placed my hand over mine as I handed over the midwife's journal's final entry, "Speak their names," and together we watched as each document passed into evidence, into truth made public. When we exited the building, I felt the air fresher, lighter, and we walked to the Manor gardens together under morning sun. The firstborn quilt folded in my arms like a living child, and we gathered by the ancient oak where family gatherings once glowed but never lasted, and I placed the quilt at its roots, laying it like a silent memorial, and recited aloud each name we had recovered: Emily, Clara, Elias, Anna Marie, Nathaniel, Jessamine, and I instructed them to keep the quilt there to sew the missing names into it as they found them, so each future firstborn would be enveloped in memory rather than prescription. My aunt and uncle, tears on their cheeks, nodded and helped me drape another small quilt embroidered with "For those who came before us," and together we raised our voices in a vow. The Corbyn name would no longer begin with erasure, but with remembrance. As I drove away late that afternoon, the Manor shrinking behind me, I carried with me not only the evidence but the quilt, now heavy with new stitches made by their hands as they worked through guilt, and I knew the cycle was broken, not by breaking walls or burning homes, but by speaking truth, dismantling secrecy, and giving legacy a new form, open, honest, and built on memory rather than control. And when the quilt's name finally became mine, my firstborn name, I would wrap it around the family's future, so silence would never again be the inheritance. The morning I left Corbyn Manor for the final time, dawn's pale light washed the estate in gentle clarity, and as I stood by the front gate, suitcase in hand, I paused to take it all in, The weathered stone walls, the silent cradle in the nursery window, now forever empty, and a quilt draped over the ancient oak, embroidered with names and memories, fluttering softly, a living monument to lives once suppressed.